final. We're very pleased to have as distinguished a man as Gordon Zahn, friend, in fact, of Thomas Merton. He's presently National Director of the PAC's Christi, U.S.A. Center on Conscience and War, which is the American section of the International Catholic Peace Movement. Gordon is also the author of many books, most particularly in Solitary Witness, The Life and Death of Franz Jagerstatter, and Another Part of the War, The Camp Simon Story. He is also editor of Thomas Merton, The Nonviolent Alternative. And today he's come to us from Boston to speak about war, protest, and the spirituality of peace in the writings and the life of his old friend, Professor Zahn.
Thank you. Thank you. The term prophet is used freely these days, perhaps too freely, but we need not be hesitant about applying it to Thomas Merton. Nowhere is it more justified than in matters bearing upon Christian responsibilities with respect to war and peace. In published writings and personal communications, Merton was a prophet in every sense of the term. Like the prophets of the Old Testament, he recognized the true dimensions of the corruption and evil of his time and tried to speak the saving word, sometimes in scathing denunciation of specific acts and prevailing trends, more often in inspirational exhortations calling Christians to a fuller and purer testimony to the faith they professed and a more effective performance of their personal responsibility to continue Christ's ministry of peace. If the call was ignored and those in power less responsive than the oppressors of past ages, the fault was not his. In true prophetic style, he struggled on, making of his monastic cell and later his hermitage a center of spiritual resistance to an immoral war then in progress, and no less crucial to the war that lies ahead, a threat to the future existence of our planet and all the creatures that inhabit it. In this he had the prophet's gifts of foresight. True, his works record no extraordinary visions or supernatural revelations. Instead, the foresight lay in his uncanny ability to see distant consequences, spiritual as well as historical, in the policies and practices of the moment. For instance, in dealing with a relatively short-lived controversy over a theologian's proposition, published in a popular Catholic journal, that a householder would be justified in shooting a less provident neighbor who tried to intrude upon the family backyard fallout shelter, Merton saw the underlying truth that was not faced then and only vaguely grasped by the American bishops in their pastoral letter on the challenge of peace, God's promise and our response. He concludes his brief commentary on that article. Let us, for the love of heaven, wake up to the fact that our own minds are just as filled with dangerous power today as the nuclear bombs themselves. And let us be very careful how we unleash the pent-up forces in the minds of others. The hour is extremely grave. The guarded statements of moral theologians are a small matter compared to the constant deluge of irresponsible opinions, criminal half-truths, and murderous images disseminated by the mass media. This problem is going to be solved in our thoughts, in our spirit, or not at all. It is because the minds of men have become what they have become that the world is poised on the brink of total disaster. Merton was not around, at least not in the flesh, to contribute the insights of his prophetic wisdom to the work of the Bernardine Committee. Yet many of his observations in published articles and his unpublished Cold War letters find echoes in the pastoral's text. the bishop's telling image of a new moment which moved them to undertake a full moral analysis of nuclear war and its implications for the church and for all humanity, was an image familiar to this cloistered Trappist. Today, what some may have dismissed in the 1960s as too apocalyptic a view of where the world was headed is at best a faint approximation of the threat we face. Jonathan Schell's recent book, The Fate of the Earth, deserves the attention and praise it has received. But Merton was writing on that theme decades before. And what Schell protests as an alliance with death is put into even starker terms in Merton's warning that what is really involved is nothing less than the free choice of global suicide, a moral evil second only to the crucifixion. Schell concludes his book on the hopeful note that we may yet avoid sinking into the final coma by awakening to the truth of our peril in time to, quote, break through the layers of our denials, put aside our faint-hearted excuses, and rise up to cleanse the earth of nuclear weapons, end quote. He does not tell us what will bring about this saving awakening, however. Merton too offers hope, but he expresses it in more contingent terms. He says, the most urgent necessity of our time is therefore not merely to prevent the destruction of the human race by nuclear war. It must be possible for every free man to refuse his consent and deny his cooperation to this gravest of crimes. There is yet another sense in which Merton deserves honor as a prophet. His influence continues and expands in the inspiration he gave to others and the ever-escalating body of literature inspired by him and his works. And this is found not only in published articles, books, and dissertations, etc. One of the sources I used in preparing this paper is the Harvard Honors Thesis, written by a young colleague of mine at the Pax Christi Center on the topic, Contemporary Catholic Theories of Nonviolence. This young man of almost unlimited promise died at the age of 24. But in the few brief years of his activity in Boston's justice and peace community, he was deeply impressed as much by the intense spirituality of Merton's works as by their content. Dan Berrigan's tribute to him, if Dorothy Day had a son according to her wish, he would have been in the image of John, could apply just as well to Merton. It is comforting to know that there are other intellectual and spiritual sons of Thomas Merton keeping his influence alive in this time of desperate need. A prophet? Yes. But a pacifist too? The question must be raised, if only because I will be discussing the spirituality of peace from a frankly pacifist perspective and borrowing heavily from Merton to support much of what I have to say. Merton's answer, at least as it is given in several of his articles, is in the negative. He was concerned about the tendency of pacifism, quote, to take on the air of a quasi-religion as though it were a kind of faith in its own right, end quote, and the inability of the pacifist, quote, to countenance any form of war, since for him to accept any war in theory or in practice would be for him to deny his faith, end quote. As he saw it, a Christian pacifist then becomes one who compounds this ambiguity by insisting, or at least implying, that pacifism is an integral part of Christianity, with the evident conclusion that Christians who are not pacifists have, by that fact, apostatized from Christianity, end quote. He is correct in everything he says, up to that howler of a non sequitur at the end. It would take a gross display of spiritual elitism and pride, to which I confess some pacifists are prone, to ignore the fact that pacifism is still not accepted by the majority of today's Christians, or to attribute that disagreeable fact to pandemic apostasy. Most pacifists I know, and this is certainly true of myself, do not fall into that tempting trap. They are more likely to follow the example of Franz Jägerstätter, the martyred Austrian peasant so admired by Merton, who, when asked to explain why he stood alone in his refusal to serve in Hitler's army, replied that his fellow Christians, including the bishops, had not been given the grace to see the immorality such service would represent. Perhaps even such a claim to a special grace of insight might strike one as too condescending. All the pacifist says of those who do not see things his way and accept orders to go to war is that they are wrong, though not necessarily culpably wrong. Or if they do recognize a departure from Christian truth in the orders to kill and destroy, and still persist in their obedience, an unfortunate weakness of will. This still sounds judgmental, and probably is, but it makes allowance, with regret, for the person who in perfectly good, however erroneous conscience, accepts war and service in war. Again, was Merton pacifist? My answer is that based on his writings and their analysis of how we came to be what we are and what it will take to change, he was more a pacifist than he was ready to admit, perhaps more than he was aware. There are points at which our positions differ, but they are few and not of major consequence. In its essentials, my view of the spirituality of peace and its expression in protest and prayer find support and validation in Merton's work. In some respects, it finds its origin there as well. It is because of this support and validation that I presume to address the subject not only from the pacifist perspective, but from that of professional sociologists as well. This may seem to be a kind of scholarly heresy, since sociology, as many practitioners of the discipline would insist, can have little to offer in so non-empirical a realm as the innermost structures of an individual's religious commitment. Merton, of course, would have his own objections, having once gone so far as to thank God that he was not a sociologist. He was wrong there too. Whatever else spirituality may mean, and however much it is formed and sustained by the indefinable and immeasurable quality of divine grace, as a motive force in the individual's behavior, it takes effect and operates through that individual's perceptions. The content and behavioral implications of such perceptions make it a proper subject of study in the sociology of perception. To treat spirituality as a complex of motivating perceptions is not to reduce it to the level of the mundane. On the contrary, it contributes to a deeper understanding of the ways in which internalized values find expression in external acts and behavior. Does this mean that since every individual's perceptions must be his or hers alone, that each person's spirituality becomes ad hoc and, in a sense, sui generis? Yes and no. This would be true were it not for the processes of socialization, which, even as they mold each of us into the unique persons we become, provide us with pattern similarities as well. From infancy on, our development is guided, sometimes determined, through exposure to the same institutions, especially family, school, and church, and less structured, though still culturally conditioned, life experiences. Each individual and each individual's spirituality are unique, but that uniqueness is better understood in most cases as a variation on a common theme. The principal components of the spirituality of peace are the perception one has of God, the perception of the proper relationship between believer and God, extending to the proper relationship of believer to believer, and the perception of the ultimate purpose and goal of those relationships. I would go so far as to suggest that any conceptualization of spirituality would have to begin with these. Nor is there anything particularly different in the basic perception the pacifist has of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and most important of all, infinitely loving and all-forgiving. His is the power to judge and to punish those who reject him and his way, to choose the path of evil, just as he promises eternal rewards to those who fulfill his will. Pretty standard stuff to this point, one would agree. Nor do pacifists differ from their fellow Christians in their belief that this God became incarnate in the one whose followers we profess to be, as a means of redeeming and saving his human creations. Unlike Homer's jealous divinities on Mount Olympus, toying with their human pawns as might suit their passing moods or fancy, the God of the Christian has more respect and infinitely more exalted plans for us. As Merton put it, this God, quotes, has chosen for himself in the mystical body of Christ an elect people, regenerated by the blood of the Savior and committed by their baptismal promise to wage war with the great enemy of peace and salvation, end quote. At this point, however, we do encounter a point of crucial difference. The God of the pacifist Christian, because he has such respect and plans, would never seek to prove a point or display even righteous anger by condemning millions of innocent men, women, and children to the dread scourge of war. And it certainly would not be his intent that those who claim to be his followers become the instruments of destruction and mass slaughter. Instead, Merton again, he brought to his disciples a vocation and a task to struggle in the world of violence to establish his peace, not only in their own hearts, but in society itself. That wars come about through human fault and weakness cannot be denied, nor can we ignore the suffering and oppression they bring. But to attribute them to the punitive excesses of an angered Lord of righteousness is to miss the point completely. The Christian is called to confront those evils in a spirit of sincere remorse, coupled with a firm attitude of complete confidence in, indeed abandonment to, the saving goodness of God's will. In this we have moved to the consideration of that second basic perception, the relationship between God and believer. This is not to be taken for a fatalistic resignation to what will be, but instead an active acceptance of that vocation and whatever it might require of one. Merton's prayer of abandonment expresses this beautifully. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I cannot see the road ahead of me, and I do not know for certain where it will end. Nor do I know myself, and the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire, and all that I am doing, I hope I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me and will never leave me alone to face my perils alone. Since we are all members of the same mystical body, this special quality of the relationship with God should carry over to our relationship with one another as well. For if we are disciples of Christ, Merton writes, we are necessarily our brother's keepers. We cannot give an irresponsible and unchristian consent to the demonic use of power for the destruction of a whole nation, a whole continent, or possibly even the whole human race. No better statement of the spirituality of peace as it bears upon our relationships with others can be found in the familiar peace prayer of St. Francis. One pleads to be made an instrument of peace, to learn to replace hatred with love, injury with pardon, despair with hope, and so on. That term instrument must be understood properly, however. It does not imply a self-abnegating depersonalization, making one a tool in a mechanistic sense. Rather, it calls for a fully reasoned and freely willed surrender of self in total commitment, in that spirit of total yet confident abandonment so movingly expressed in Merton's prayer. This is the other side of the pacifist perception of God, and from it we derive the pacifist alternative to war and preparation for war, the theory and practice of nonviolence. We are told, and as Christians we presumably accept, that God's power is made perfect and manifest in our human infirmity, that no matter how perilous our situation may be, the gates of hell will not prevail. Of course, this is no guarantee of victory or success, as the world may define them. History provides evidence enough that those who appear to be the good guys are all too often victimized by the bad. But the same uncertainty of outcome is present in war, with the crucial difference that in war there is a certainty that people, all too often innocent people, will be hurt and killed. Now, given the nature of modern weaponry and the stated intent of national leaders to use them, the future existence of the planet is placed in doubt. One often hears a false charge that pacifists are indifferent to evil and the need to combat it. The commitment to nonviolence as an alternative of war is not indifference, but rather a refusal to succumb to the delusion that it is somehow possible to overcome evil by adding to it. Merton is too widely recognized as one of the leading apostles of Christian nonviolence to need citation on this point. His writings on the subject are so extensive and compelling that I do not hesitate to repeat what I have said elsewhere, that this will prove to be his major and most enduring contribution. As such, they stand alone in their own right, but they also provide the transition to the third of the basic components or perceptions mentioned above, the pacifist perception of the ultimate purpose and goal to which we as Christians are committed. In his footnote to Ulysses, he distinguishes between nonviolence as a pursuit of truth, the nonviolence of the strong, which can never fail, and nonviolence as a means to power, the nonviolence of the weak, which carries no similar promise of success. It is surprising to find this admirer of Martin Luther King, an ardent supporter of the civil rights movement, even at times its more radical Black Power segment, striking a note which seems to distance himself from both. He writes of nonviolence, "It does not say we shall overcome, so much as this is the day of the Lord, and whatever may happen to us, he shall overcome." It is here, in the eschatological dimension of nonviolent resistance, that Merton makes his most significant contribution to the spirituality of peace. His frequent use of the term post-Christian era takes on a double meaning in the context of nonviolence. Most obvious, of course, is the lesson that Christians can no longer act, assuming they ever could, in the confidence that secular authorities will take Christian principles into account in formulating their programs and policies, especially those related to international relations and conflict. The long history of warfare does not provide many, one might suggest no, instances of rulers or generals incorporating the limits imposed by the conditions of the just war, so carefully elaborated by St. Thomas, whose day we celebrate today, and others in their strategic planning or military operations. However fervently the rhetoric of war might continue to extol religious themes and virtues, one cannot ignore the fact that the missiles launched, even from a blessed Trident submarine, that Auschwitz of Puget Sound, as Archbishop Hunthausen has named it, were designed and intended to commit precisely those offenses against God and man himself condemned by Vatican II. It is, as Merton said, we are no longer living in a Christian world. Today, a non-Christian world still retains a few vestiges of Christian morality, a few formulas and cliches, which serve on appropriate occasions to adorn indignant editorials and speeches. But otherwise, we witness deliberate campaigns to oppose and eliminate all education in Christian truth and morality, end quote. There is another more profound sense in which ours is a post-Christian era, however. This is the day of the Lord. Christ has come. The kingdom is here, within us. Not in the fullness of its promised glory, perhaps, but the promise is still there for all who accept it and live their lives accordingly. In terms of the spirituality of peace, whatever sufferings we have to face are as nothing compared with the moral danger that lies in the temptation to repay violence with violence, and by so doing, turn away from him and the protection he will provide. Taken in this perspective, the insane rush for security through new weapons of ever-increasing destructiveness is a betrayal of the true security which is the Christians for the asking. Again, in Merton's work, It is no exaggeration to say that our times are apocalyptic, in the sense that we seem to have come to a point at which all the hidden, mysterious dynamism of the history of salvation revealed in the Bible has flowered into final and decisive crisis. The term end of the world may or may not be one that we are capable of understanding, but at any rate, we seem to be assisting at the unwrapping of the mysteriously vivid symbols of the last book of the New Testament. In their nakedness, they reveal to us our own selves as the men whose lot it is to live in the time of a possibly ultimate decision. In a word, the end of the world is quite really and quite literally up to us and to our immediate descendants, if any. And this, I might venture to suggest, is more apocalyptic than anything our fathers discovered in the revelations of St. John. End quote. The three major themes or components of the spirituality of peace, at least as I have presented them, leave little room for Merton's or the bishop's persistence in defending the theory of justifiable war. There is evidence enough in his writings that he was aware that in practice, the traditional formulations are almost totally irrelevant to the reality of modern war and nuclear war in particular. It is tempting to speculate on where he would be today, now that bishops have rediscovered and legitimized, though not yet endorsed, the kind of pacifism he so regularly rejected. Pointless, too, for whether he accepted the label or not, his books and articles are there to provide support for those who do. They also provide invaluable guidelines as to how the spirituality of peace can be given expression in the behavior of individuals. There is an unfortunate tendency on the part of many, including pacifists, to speak in terms of a dichotomy, a choice between prayer and similar forms of spiritual activity on the one hand, and involvement in direct action protest on the other. I prefer to see the two options as the opposite ends of a single continuum, with the actual positions taken located in between, each representing the mix of both best suited to the individual's unique variation on the spirituality theme, or determined by the circumstances of his or her life. Thus, one might expect a strictly cloistered contemplative, or the kind of isolated hermit that Merton yearned to be but never was, would have precious little opportunity or inclination to engage in outward protest, relying instead on prayer and other devotional or penitential practices to halt the drift toward the war that is forbidden. Parents, too, might find familial responsibilities too demanding to permit the luxury of risking arrest or prison for civil disobedience or other forms of activism. Some might even have difficulty finding the time to engage in legal demonstrations. In neither case need protest activity be eliminated altogether. There are always letters to be written, petitions to be distributed and signed, vigils and picketing, organizations to be formed and joined. And if I can get a personal commercial in, as a member of Pax Christi, U.S.A.'s Executive Council, we yearn for an active and strong Pax Christi Canada to be with us at these international meetings that we attend every now and then. But that's up to you. Heads of households have gone further to engage in symbolic tax resistance, though few are in a position to risk their family's welfare by refusing to pay taxes altogether or renouncing taxable earnings. For their part, religious communities, in addition to participating in some kind of tax resistance, might give thought to the possibility of making themselves havens of sanctuary for criminals of conscience, taking as their model their counterparts in Europe, which provided sanctuary for Jews and saved many from extermination camps. Even those monasteries and convents which will concentrate on prayer and penance as their most proper expression of the spirituality of peace can reach out to the consciences of others through teaching and works of scholarship. Merton himself is the best example of what can be done in this respect. Despite the confines of the Trappist life, and even though silenced for a time by superiors who considered it unseemly for a monk to involve himself in public controversy, he found it possible to bring respectability to a position which until then had been dismissed by his fellow Catholics as something bordering on heresy. Nor was this all. He was indirectly responsible for more direct action protest on the part of others not subject to those limitations. His 1964 retreat on the spiritual roots of protest was especially significant. Within a short time, most of his retreatants were in prison for various actions of public protest. One might go so far as to suggest that the great Catholic peace conspiracy of the Vietnam years had its real beginning in the quiet setting of Gethsemane. It is difficult to conceive of prayer by itself, if it is difficult to conceive of prayer by itself as an effective or sufficient Christian peace witness, this is even more true of the other pole of the continuum. No matter how extreme or disruptive, direct action protest can draw inspiration and support from prayer. The Berrigans and their followers, the Berrigans incidentally were two of the people led into a life of crime at that retreat, offers striking evidence of how this works. In the eyes of the law, this loose and widespread network of separate but affinity-minded groups constitute a criminal underground. Nevertheless, all their actions, whether blocking entry to nuclear facilities, climbing fences to destroy nuclear weapon components, digging graves on the White House lawn, or pouring blood on the Pentagon, can be seen as spiritual events and experiences. They begin with sessions of common prayer and reflection in which participants make themselves open to a call to specific acts of civil disobedience. Once the decision is made, there is more prayer and meditation to help find the strength and confidence needed to face up to the chosen task and the penalties it could bring. Finally, after the deed is done, the blood poured, the ashes strewn, the missile cones damaged, the criminals join in prayer again while they await arrest. Not all direct action is confrontational. Indeed, Merton, among others, voiced concern and warned against the danger of escalation beyond peaceful protest, in which case, as he put it, it may also be escalating into self-contradiction. It is again a question of determining the right mix for each, which in turn depends upon that uniqueness of the individual's spirituality within the limits set by the components I have identified. Merton was concerned that the Berrigan-type actions represented a kind of desperation that might frighten rather than edify the uncommitted public. He had profound respect for someone like Dorothy Day, who, though ever willing to refuse cooperation she felt contributed to war or the war mentality, and ever ready to go to jail for her belief in peace, did so without seeking publicity. And he had the highest praise for Franz Jägerstätter, who was not confrontational at all, but still accepted martyrdom rather than submit to the state's demand that he take part in an unjust war. It is well to note, though, he waited until he actually received induction orders to make his heroic refusal. Anyone familiar with the lives of Dorothy Day and Franz Jägerstätter knows how much prayer and penance meant to them and the part these played in providing and sustaining the commitment behind Dorothy's lifelong practice of the spiritual and corporal works of mercy and Jägerstätter's refusal to violate his conscience. Too often, though, we write them off as exceptional cases which of course they are, beyond our more normal spiritual capacities, which they are not. It might be helpful to consider one more example to make the point. I've referred earlier to John Leary, that young colleague of mine, admirer of Thomas Merton, who died of cardiac arrest at the age of 24, while jogging home from a full day of work at our Christi Center to Boston's Catholic Workers' Soup Kitchen, where he lived and served the needs of the poor and elderly. This extraordinarily gifted young man had come to Boston 6 years before as a Harvard freshman. When he died, his wake and funeral drew hundreds of mourners who had come to know him through the many peace and justice activities for which he had assumed personal responsibility. Though not a leader in the sense of public recognition, his death left our center and a host of other organizations in a state of emotional and organizational disarray from which we have not yet recovered completely. A review of his appointment books for the last 5 years of his life record the meetings he attended, demonstrations he helped arrange, talks given and workshops conducted, and innumerable other services performed and favors done. A typical week might have had as many as 15 to 20 such obligations. In addition, he was arrested several times for criminal trespass, twice for intruding into a forbidden courtyard at a nuclear weapons laboratory to pray and distribute devotional handouts as part of the weekly vigils he helped organize, more often for sitting in at abortion clinics. Remarkable as all this activism was, it was matched by the extent and intensity of his prayer life and devotional activity. In taking stock of what we have lost, we find an almost perfect blending of protest and prayer. Why have I devoted so much time to him? There's a matter of emotional attachment, of course, but much more to the point, he shows what can be done. In time, John Leary might have become as well-known a name as Merton, the Berrigans, and Dorothy Day, and may even have surpassed them in his contributions to peace and social justice. As it was, he was just a young college student, a worker in the ranks who was able to make a real difference and do so in 6 short years. When he graduated from Harvard, he was interviewed, and in his interview he made a statement fitting the talk we heard this morning from Sister Elena. They asked him why he wasn't getting himself the same kind of job that the other people were in his graduating class. And well, echoes of Franz Jägerstätter, he said he wasn't going to jump from one speeding train to another. And then, but he went on to say that his aspirations at that time were just to find people to live with, to work with, to pray with, and see what comes from there. That, I think, is the Merton type of approach. This should be a comfort and challenge to us. Not all will or can give equally effective expression to the spirituality of peace as the John Leary and the more widely known inspiration models I have mentioned. At best, we can aspire and strive, knowing we will probably fall short. But when we do, we can renew our good intentions and strive anew. Nor will everyone agree with the pacifist interpretations I have placed on the spirituality of peace. However much those who disagree may accept and share the basic perceptions upon which it is based. In the final analysis, the spirituality of peace is more than the perceptions from which it draws content and form, and to this extent it does go beyond the reach of sociology. The perceptions can be objectified and classified, even analyzed in terms of psychological and cultural implications. But it is the quality of commitment that counts, and this involves something extra that escapes even the most imaginative methods and techniques social science can devise. That something extra is the touch of grace of which Jägerstätter spoke, the grace which informs the intellect and strengthens the will. As Christians, we believe that grace will become available to us if we but accept it. A half-century ago, the eminent sociologist Pitirim Sorokin traced what he called the crisis of our age to a shift from a culture keyed to the higher realms of spirit and mind to one in which perceptions and behavior were increasingly dominated by material and sensual concerns and values. If his analysis still holds true, and I for one believe it does, the crisis will not be resolved unless and until the direction of this shift is reversed. A first and necessary step would be for each of us, man or woman, to make a personal reassessment of his or her spiritual commitments and the answer we give to these three basic questions. What do I believe about God? How do I relate to God and my fellow human beings? Do I have faith enough and confidence enough to take risks he may ask of me as an individual and of us as a people, to turn away from policies and preparations which would destroy the world and humanity, to save them? The answers we give will determine whether that gift of grace will be recognized as such and accepted. Merton had his answer and considered it important enough to repeat in several of his essays on the subject of peace and nuclear war. It has lost none of its relevance and gained in urgency since it was written. Let it serve as a conclusion to these remarks. It is no longer reasonable or right to leave all decisions to a largely anonymous power elite that is driving us all in our passivity toward ruin. We have to make ourselves heard. Every individual Christian has a grave responsibility to protest clearly and forcibly against trends that lead inevitably to crimes which the church condemns and deplores. Ambiguity, hesitation, and compromise are no longer permissible. We must find some new and constructive way of settling international disputes. This may be extraordinarily difficult. Obviously, war cannot be abolished by mere wishing. Severe sacrifices may be demanded, and the results will hardly be visible in our time. But the time is rapidly running out. As you see, I'm stereo, so I should be able to hear, but if not, I may have to ask someone to repeat what they ask. I'll turn this up. Yeah, okay. Yes.
If Christian pacifists had been a majority in 1939, how do you see them as stopping us evil and Hitler?
If we had been in a situation where Christians had recognized the pacifist implications of their faith, there would have been, first of all, it would have been a much more universal type movement than just seeing it in terms of how we would have stopped it at that particular time. One of the great tragedies of the time is that German Christians did not recognize the pacifist implications of their Christianity either, except for someone like Jägerstätter. It would have gone before then. It's like, I guess all history, all attempts to reevaluate history is like peeling an onion. I think if we had been Christians before Hitler came to power, Hitler would not have come to power. It's at these particular points that we have to see it, and obviously, to pick a particular point in time, you are faced with a situation that, at least, again, in contemporary perceptions, leaves no alternative. I think the teachings we ought to get from Merton, the teachings we ought to get from our Christian belief is there is always an alternative. This is one of the things in the Bishop's Pastoral, the American Bishop's Pastoral, Heffery Memorandum, I think probably the most significant statement is that they have in there is that we must come to regard as normal. We must come to regard as normal the path of persecution and the possibility of martyrdom. And I think if we start framing our thoughts about this in that type of view, we won't necessarily get to that. We always have to Merton certainly made allowance for the fact that a non-violent response to violence may put us back in the catacombs. But we were there once, we got out of them. And that, I think, is a type of spiritual commitment that he would recognize as essential.
I think the point he's trying to make is how do we proceed from now?
Pardon?
How do we proceed from now?
How we proceed from now is...
Because we do have a certain situation, a certain time in history.
Yeah.
Things should have happened in the past and haven't. So what's the best way to proceed? Is probably by, our example. But in turn, the example has to be structured so that another tower which has faults as we do.
Well, that's the point. I think that's part of his abandonment thing. The beginnings we can make, each and every one as Christians, is to recognize that there's probably much more potential in prayer and penance than there is in the MX. And we move from there then to the idea that, okay, we are also called upon to give some kind of active witness to this commitment that we have. And that's where I say it might be some very small, some very symbolic thing. Certainly all of us can do that. Others are in a position where they can do larger things, more effective things. But to build this, to spread these interpretations, at least to convert the Christians to the Christian thing, would have worked. And one of the first things we have to do, I'm sorry to say this is one of the things, I had the opportunity to work with Bishop Gumbleton on preparing what was really the final draft of Part 3 of the pastoral that was presented to the committee to be polished up, to be presented to the bishops. It was after the third draft, wasn't it? And we had a stunning, if I must say so myself, 2 paragraphs in which we denounced the ease with which people use the term enemy to refer to the Soviet Union. That they are competitors, they're adversaries, they aren't necessarily enemies. And to begin thinking of this, again, it's a matter of the perception and the language we use. And I think all these things can be done. And by our projecting upon them the kind of, well, we're not certain this world domination that justifies our, not yours, ever-increasing military budgets and something like this. The perception is self-defeating.
In many ways, they're a reflection of our own evil.
Yeah, it is a mirror image. I mean, Mr. President Reagan made the point that this is one of the mistakes of the time. People see this as a mirror image. It is a mirror image that we have to recognize and so forth. And I think that, who can do it if the Christians can't do it?
Don't things have to begin with our own everyday relations with those around us, and also in our relations with other countries other than the Soviet Union, with those in Central America, with those in the developing nations, and so on. If we deal with them in a more Christian way, then these nations will feel less the need to bring in some other saving power.
Dorothy Day used to like to quote Eric Gill whenever she had a chance to, and it all goes together. It does all go together. You have to be better to your neighbor, to the members of your family, and more loving, more considerate, and something like this. But at the same time, you can also be to other groups in your own community and to other communities within your own nation and finally to other nations within your own world. And it isn't that, we sometimes see it in terms of a time sequence. You're not going to be able to make friends with the communists until you have made friends with your neighbor. There's no reason why you can't make friends with your neighbor and the communists at the same time, rather than see it in a serial type of thing. Yes.
Then I see that the American and the Canadian bishops think alike. However, the South American bishops, in my opinion, do not think that way. And you know and I know the number of religious orders that are on their side.
That's true.
Now, I'd like to have your comment. How are these two opposites supposed to be the church?
Well, those who have the grace have a responsibility to make it known to others. I mean, this is that aside that I had about the Pax Christi thing. I thought you were going to get into the French bishops and the German bishops. They don't agree with our bishops either, or something like this. Well, this is also true of Pax Christi chapters at their international meetings. We have the English-speaking sections, the American section, the British section, and the Irish section. Yes, we're much more pacifist-oriented and certainly much stronger on the issue of nonviolence than some of the continental sections that are there. That's why we'd welcome a fourth English-speaking, English and French-speaking, if you will, member of those international councils. But I must say that since I first attended one of those things, there has been a movement, distinct movement. Now, maybe the movement is largely due to the development of different weapons and the greater urgency and immediacy of the moment that people recognize. But I think you would find that some of the continental groups are not only now receptive to ideas that we brought years ago and that they thought were really far out, but are very strongly in favor of them. We still haven't converted the French Pax Christi people, but I think we've made great inroads with the Germans, and the Austrians are polite. I mean, they aren't, I'm quite sure if the decision goes in our direction, we'll have very strong support from the Austrians. If it goes against us, they'll have very strong support from the Austrians. It's not that they have no fixed principles or anything like this. It's just that they're polite.
Don't you think that the roots of war have a lot to do with our standard of living? Because really, in the United States especially, it's perceived that the United States has to protect that standard of living in order for the political powers to continue in their power. So that's primarily what they're protecting. Well, any one of us can reduce that standard of living. Any one of us can probably live with half what we live with. So that doesn't become a necessity that we have a standard of living that is way up here, which creates much of the injustice that causes the war.
Yeah, when I said at the end this reassessment should focus on those three questions, it didn't mean that the reassessment doesn't go further. The reassessment probably should also include to what extent is the want of others equated with the excess we have, or something like this.
We don't have to use that. We can each reduce our standard of living, not consume more than we need to consume, not use more energy than we need.
Yeah, well, the Canadian bishops have made a very good statement on this type of thing. I understand that when the American bishops finish their statement, it's going to be going to stir more controversy than the one on War and Peace did. So I think there's movement question is how much time is there, and that's why we have to, I certainly agree with all these people who say it's a matter of changing lifestyle, of bringing economic justice into world affairs, and so it is that. But the immediate urgent thing right now is that these weapons are there, and the time span is down to 6 minutes, and something like this. And I think that's why the bishops put their War and Peace statement ahead of the capitalism statement. They certainly know that the capitalism statement is going to deal with the fundamental reasons why we have these things at the present time. But people are being trained to press those buttons. And so that's the immediacy, the urgency of the thing that probably gave it priority in their statements. And I think we have to recognize that too, that it probably will take longer and be more difficult to convince people, including ourselves, that we have to give up some things to make things better. But there are pretty good arguments that strengthen our case against at least stopping this right now. People recognize the threat. What they don't recognize is that they can do something about it. And that, I think, is where Merton says we have to do something about it. We can't let it ride in the hands of some impersonal elite. Yes.
Whenever someone asks pacifists to consider how during World War II it seemed that it was military might which defeated fascism, that's always a question which pacifists have to very seriously consider. But then when you think about in 1984, we're only 40 years after that war, and if the bombs go off, in some ways fascism will have won the war. And as you think about the roots of the war in Vietnam, go back to how Vietnam was divided after World War II. And when you think about how Ho Chi Minh, at the end of World War I, was at Versailles asking to be heard and he was refused admission, you see that the conflict that we are engaged in now has deep and extensive historical roots, which will inform any position, pacifist, Christian, or person who accepts limited warfare.
Well, that's an own business. Yeah.
I'd just like to, many of us will have many responses to today. Some of us are in Canada trying to form a Pax Christi organization. And if you would like to put your energy with a group of people that are trying to dig up and nourish the Catholic peace tradition, you can give us your name and we'll put you on a mailing list and if you like, help you to get a Pax Christi chapter started in your area.
Yes, I will endorse what you say. There's one point that I think can actually be strengthened. In some respects, we have lost the war, even if the bombs don't go off. Those of us who were unfortunately old enough to, fortunately or unfortunately old enough to remember back into the 30s, one of the horrible things about the Nazi that brought people to oppose them and something like that was their theory of total war. Our entire defense establishment is based on total war. MAD is based on the total destruction of other countries. We have accepted that most crucial part of the of Hitler's idea of what people against people warfare, something like that. So the bombs don't have to go off. We've lost on that score. We made some gains on others, probably, but the question is whether those gains could not have been made without war, and without the cost that the war had. Yes, now this is going to be the test. Okay.
Another dangerous proposition that we've all accepted is one that was mentioned here a few minutes ago, and that is this premise that everything operates on the principle of competition. Like our standard of living supposedly has to fall so that somebody else's standard of living has to rise. I don't know if that's necessarily true.
No.
Maybe if we all cooperate whole world is accepting, and it sets us all off against one another.
Well, I think,
Christian principle, I think.
Again, I'm not privy to the discussions that the bishops are having on this question now. I think, though, if we look at the distribution of the resources of the world as they are today, it's quite clear that some don't have because others have too much. Some are making more use of the limited resources of the world. And so if we see it on that basis, I think the point you question is pretty difficult to counteract. However, the second point that you have, that this was the whole idea of W.H. Ferry's triple revolution and something like this, that you could indeed have international programs which would increase the resources of the world to such an extent so that the others could be brought up without necessarily drastically reducing those who at the present time are living a comfortable existence. That's the other side of it. But how one does that is the problem. The point I thought you were going to make is one that always troubles me particularly. I wouldn't want to even appear to be questioning the validity of the thesis of Bread for the World or something like this, a group in which I have very great attachment, to which I have very great attachment. But the economics of the world situation are such that even if I gave up eating hamburgers altogether, it wouldn't necessarily help the people those who are being deprived of grains because we are feeding animals to make hamburgers or something like this. That's where the mechanisms get beyond us. And the north-south difficulties are largely due again to an economic order that seems to be completely out of control. That even nations can't control the operations of multinational corporations. If we could somehow develop an international political cooperation at the level of this economic control that's been developed, then I think we'd be in a much better position too to take care of the wants of those who are deprived without necessarily taking on their standard of living. But I think the situation as it now is such that to reduce the tensions, to equalize proper access to the goods of the world, those who have in abundance have to be prepared to take on responsibility to improve the situation of those who don't have enough.
At the same time, what we tended to do in many countries is to go in there and create artificial needs for things that really don't fit into their culture at all. It completely disrupts the culture.
That's a Latin American situation.
No, how do you go back from that? No, I was in Africa for years. And this is back in the early 60s. And, through American and Indian films that they, through by their example in those films, they inculcate in the minds of the people there the idea of having all of the excesses that we had. And with television, it's becoming omnipresent, it's even getting worse. So, we have to cool that down. I think focusing on the communications media and the communication of images of excessive wants is something that needs to be focused on. I mean, you have to put out that fire, I think.
I think that's true too. And it's within our society as well as within the world communities. Okay.
Thank you, Gordon. Okay, I'd just like to sum up for us today, and just with a few comments, very brief, I can assure you. One is, again, to remind you that if you're interested in any of the other seminars or workshops that are planned for the remainder of the St. Jerome Center year, the Women in the Church of Christian Feminism, which will have the Canadian Bishops' chairperson, Dr. Elizabeth Lassalle, who's been appointed by the Canadian Bishops to be the chairperson of their ad hoc committee on the role of women in the church. She's a theologian at the Université d'Ottawa, and Professor Joanne Dewart of the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, and Elizabeth Kilbourne, who's an Anglican priest, will be part of that day, and I'd like to encourage you all, male and female, to come and be a part of this day-long seminar on March the 10th. A number of people are already registering in advance, so if you're interested, I would encourage you. We have a workshop next weekend that is on liturgy and ministry in the parish and praying the hours by John Mello from Notre Dame, and I'm sure Elena would support me in recommending him highly as a dynamic person who will provide quite an event, and it will include Mass. Showing of the film, Monk on the Run, ghastly title, isn't it? Will be shown from 3:30 to 4 at the very end today. The bookstall will be still open for some of you. I might recommend that although we had some difficulty getting Elena's book here, and Gordon's as well, we had hoped that Broughton's would be able to provide them. They ran into all kinds of difficulties in some respects. I might bring to your attention that the book Program and Process has an excellent essay by Gordon on war and peace, and also a fine paper by Ken Russell on the late contemplative. Both of them are splendid pieces, and we're only sorry we don't have Elena's in there as well, but you might wish to take a look at that. I don't think there's anything else by way of the practical details, except to tell you that if you haven't been put on our mailing list and you'd just like to know something about the St. Jerome Center, if you just fill out one of these forms and leave them with my secretary, who will be over in the corner with the tapes, you're more than welcome to do so. Similarly, if you would like any of the exceptional talks today, and would like to have a recording of them, we have them duplicated on campus here, and we make them available for you at pretty well at cost price. So if you'd like to put in a request for that, you're also encouraged to do so. The St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience was launched a year and a half ago by the now president of St. Jerome's, Father Norman Choate. Father Choate's vision for the center was to incarnate in very explicit terms the primary concerns of the modern Christian for spirituality and the social justice commitment that interrelate. I can think of no better person than Thomas Merton, who in his own life provides this marvelous interpenetration of the social justice emphasis with a pronounced, deeply rooted Catholic commitment to truth and understanding. It is for this reason that the St. Jerome Center has established now an annual seminar on Thomas Merton. All its other programs change yearly, but this one remains. We changed the title, we have different speakers, but it remains. It remains because, in a way, Thomas Merton stands as a solitary witness to a time, an end time, that requires detailed reflection and commitment. His death has not in any way altered this, and it is with the advantage of having people of the caliber of today's speakers, Elena Malitz, Kenneth Russell, and Gordon Zahn, to come and with their scholarship and with their own commitment and faith to talk about this extraordinary man. They do more than simply provide an occasion for a reflection on an individual, thereby turning Merton into a kind of cult figure, and do something far more important. They take his thought, they examine it, and they attest to its relevance, a relevance of faith and passionate commitment. On behalf of the St. Jerome Center, I thank you for coming to be part of our day, and I hope to see some of you again. Good day.